It was a cold November evening in 1964, in the quiet city of Albany, New York. Street lights flickered through a thin veil of mist. The air was still. Inside a modest two-story home on Madison Avenue, the kind of place where neighbors waved good morning and never locked their doors, something unimaginable was happening. When police officers arrived, they were greeted not by the calm routine of a domestic evening, but by horror. Inside, they found Catherine Blackburn, a 33-year-old woman, lifeless on her living room floor. Her home showed signs of a violent struggle, furniture overturned, drawers pulled open, the faint scent of fear still lingering in the air. She had been sexually assaulted and brutally murdered. The discovery shattered the peace of Albany. Catherine wasn't some recluse. She was well-liked, gentle, a woman with friends, routines, and a future that ended too soon. Reporters flooded the neighborhood, their cameras clicking, headlines screaming, "Murder in Madison Avenue Home." Neighbors whispered behind drawn curtains. Parents locked their doors for the first time. The city, once considered safe, suddenly didn't feel safe anymore. Police promised swift justice. Detectives worked around the clock, convinced the killer had to be someone nearby. But as the hours turned to days and days turned to weeks, the case grew stranger. There was no clear suspect, no solid leads, no eyewitnesses. And somewhere out there, a killer was still free, walking the same streets, blending back into ordinary life. What began as a shocking murder would soon become something else entirely. A cold case buried under decades of dust and silence, until one day, technology and time would bring the truth back to light. For decades, the Catherine Blackburn case gathered dust in the archives of the Albany Police Department. The folder, thin and faded, sat among hundreds of other unsolved crimes, its label barely legible after 60 winters. Inside were yellowed reports, black and white photos, and brittle notes written by men who had long since retired or passed away. Each new detective who opened the file hoped to find the detail everyone else had missed. But every time, the same silence stared back. Years turned into decades. Catherine's name slipped from headlines, then from conversations, and finally from memory. The world moved forward. New presidents, new wars, new technologies. But in one old cabinet in the basement of the Albany precinct, her story remained frozen in 1964. In the 1980s, when DNA testing first appeared, the evidence from her case was reviewed, but it was too degraded, too fragile to test. The handkerchief found beneath her body was carefully rebagged and stored again, its secrets still sealed. By the early 2000s, even that hope had faded. To most, the case was history. But to one detective, it was unfinished business. In 2018, a young investigator named Detective Melissa Morey reopened the file. She wasn't even born when Catherine was killed, but something about the case haunted her. She spent nights reading every page, retracing every photograph, studying every word of those who came before her. She believed that somewhere, buried under time, a clue was still waiting. Morey reached out to the Cold Case Analysis Center at Russell Sage College, a small team of criminologists and forensic students known for solving forgotten crimes. Together, they began the painstaking process of re-examining every piece of evidence, fingerprints, fibers, even the old handkerchief. Technology had advanced dramatically since the last test. Now, even the smallest trace of DNA, invisible to the naked eye, could tell a story. The handkerchief was sent to a specialized lab. For weeks, nothing came back. Then, one late afternoon, an email arrived. The lab had extracted a viable DNA profile. It was the first new clue in more than half a century. From there, the search moved into the realm of forensic genealogy, the cutting-edge science of tracing family trees through DNA matches. Dozens of distant relatives appeared in the data: distant cousins, great-nephews, forgotten branches of families long scattered across America. Piece by piece, investigators built a genetic puzzle that slowly narrowed towards a single name. That name was Joseph Nowakowski, born in 1936, a quiet man who had once lived just blocks away from Catherine Blackburn's home. He worked odd jobs, drank too much, and was known for violent outbursts. But in 1964, no one had connected him to the murder. There had been no witnesses, no fingerprints, no reason to suspect him. He died in 1998, decades before DNA could speak for him. When investigators found his death record, they hesitated. How do you prove guilt against a man who's been dead for 25 years? The answer came through science and perseverance. With a court order, authorities exhumed Nowakowski's remains from a small cemetery outside Albany. Forensic experts carefully collected bone samples and ran comparative DNA testing. The wait was agonizing, but when the results came back, there was no room for doubt. The match was perfect, 1 in a trillion. After 61 years, the mystery that had haunted a city was finally solved. Detective Morey stood before the press in a quiet room at the Albany Police Headquarters. Behind her, on a small easel, was Catherine Blackburn's photograph, smiling, alive, frozen in time. Her family, now 3 generations removed, listened through tears. There would be no trial, no punishment, no confession, but there was truth. And in the world of cold cases, truth is the closest thing to justice. As the conference ended, Melissa closed the old folder for the last time. She placed it on her desk beside the new digital report, past and present, side by side. And for the first time in 60 years, the Catherine Blackburn case was no longer a mystery. It was a story completed. When the truth finally surfaced after 6 long decades, the city of Albany seemed to breathe again. For years, Catherine Blackburn had existed only as a name on a cold file, a symbol of loss, frozen in 1964. But now, her story had come full circle. The woman who once vanished into silence had found her voice once more. Detective Melissa Morey, who led the final investigation, still remembers the day the DNA match came back. She said it wasn't triumph she felt, it was peace. Peace for Catherine, for her family, and for every detective who had once carried the weight of this case on their shoulders. Melissa still keeps the original case file on her desk. The folder is worn, its corners bent from time, but inside it holds the story of perseverance, proof that justice, no matter how delayed, is never denied. Today, Catherine's story is more than a solved crime. It's a lesson in humanity. At Russell Sage College, criminology students study her case as an example of how science and compassion can work hand in hand. They learn that behind every fingerprint and strand of DNA lies a person, someone who lived, loved, and was loved in return. For many of these young investigators, the Blackburn case is their first real understanding that cold cases aren't just puzzles to be solved, they're promises to be kept. Across Albany, people who once spoke of fear now speak of her with reverence. Neighbors who remembered that terrible night now recall the woman she was before it, kind, soft-spoken, the one who always smiled at children and brought cookies to the church bake sale. Her name, once whispered with pity, is now spoken with respect. The police department has created a small memorial wall for unsolved and resolved cold cases,
And at its center sits Catherine's photograph. It's not large or ornate, just a simple frame beneath a brass plaque that reads, "Justice may sleep, but it never dies." Visitors often stop to look at her picture, not out of curiosity, but gratitude. Her family, now spread across several generations, still visits Albany every year on the anniversary of her death. They bring flowers, always white roses, and place them at her old doorstep on Madison Avenue. There are no reporters, no cameras, no speeches. Only quiet moments of reflection and a soft prayer whispered into the evening wind. For them, this isn't closure, because closure doesn't exist when you lose someone that way. But it is peace. Peace in knowing the truth, peace in knowing that even after 60 decades, there were still people who refused to give up on Catherine. And for those who walk past that old house on Madison Avenue, where the porch light once flickered through the fog of 1964, it's no longer a place of tragedy. It's a place of remembrance, of resilience, and of hope. A reminder that time can wound, but it can also heal. That the past, when faced with courage, can finally rest. Every story, no matter how cold, leaves behind a lesson. The Catherine Blackburn case is no longer just about a murder solved. It is about what it took to get there. It is about persistence, courage, and the belief that truth cannot be buried forever. For decades, Catherine's name sat forgotten inside a folder in a dusty cabinet, surrounded by silence. And yet that silence was never truly empty. It waited. It waited for science to advance, for new eyes to look again, for hearts that refuse to let go. And in that waiting, we find one of the most human truths of all. Time may pass, but justice never forgets. The detectives who worked on her case, those who are gone and those who still remain, represent generations of people who carried the same mission: to speak for the voiceless. Some chased the case in vain. Others handed it off, hoping the next set of hands would succeed where they had failed. They didn't know that 60 years later, a young woman born decades after Catherine's death would be the one to finish what they started. Her name was Melissa Morey, and she proved that persistence powered by empathy can outlive even death itself. In classrooms and training centers today, her story is retold not for the tragedy, but for the triumph. It reminds young detectives and students that every case file has a pulse, and that sometimes justice doesn't arrive on time, but it always arrives when someone refuses to stop searching. Science gave investigators the tools, but it was humanity that gave them purpose. And beyond the police stations and laboratories, Catherine's story still echoes quietly in homes across Albany. When people drive past Madison Avenue, they no longer see a crime scene. They see a reminder of resilience, that even after 61 years, one truth found its way home. We live in a world where data moves faster than memory, where technology changes by the second, and stories fade overnight. But every photograph tucked in a dusty folder, every piece of evidence sealed in a box, represents a life that mattered. Behind every fingerprint, every strand of DNA, there was someone who once laughed, dreamed, and loved in return. Catherine's story teaches us that justice isn't a destination, it's a commitment. It's a promise we make to the past that we won't look away. And as long as there are people willing to reopen those forgotten files, to listen to the quiet voices of the lost, justice will never die. Somewhere in another small police department, another detective might be opening another old case file right now. Maybe there's a name on that folder that no one has spoken in 50 years. Maybe tonight, that name will find its way back into the light. For every cold case that still waits for light, there is hope. There is always hope.